Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe, your trusted place to improve your English while learning about important global events in a clear, calm, and educational way. I am Adam, and as always, I am joined by Julia. Today, we are starting a very important and widely discussed topic called nationwide protests in Iran and the U.S. response, conflict, sanctions, and diplomacy. This topic often appears in international news, and understanding it can help you follow global discussions more confidently while also building strong English vocabulary related to world affairs.
Thank you, Adam, and hello to all our listeners around the world. This topic is important because Iran is a country that plays a significant role in regional and global politics, and when large-scale protests happen there, many countries, international organizations, and media outlets begin to pay close attention. By discussing this topic today, we are not trying to persuade or judge anyone, but rather to explain why such events matter globally and how different countries, including the United States, usually respond from a diplomatic and political perspective.
That's right, Julia. Iran frequently appears in global news because it has a large population, a long and rich history, and a strategic geographic position in the Middle East. It is located near important trade routes and energy corridors, which means that developments inside Iran can sometimes influence regional stability and international discussions. For English learners, this topic is especially useful because it introduces words like geopolitics, international attention, regional influence, and foreign policy, which are commonly used in news reports and academic conversations.
Exactly, Adam. When we hear about nationwide protests, it usually means that demonstrations are happening in many cities and regions at the same time, which naturally attracts global attention. Governments, including the United States, closely observe these situations to understand possible political, economic, or diplomatic outcomes. Learning how these events are discussed in neutral and formal English can help listeners better understand international news without feeling confused or overwhelmed.
Before we go deeper into today's discussion, dear listeners, we kindly ask for your support. If you find our content helpful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our educational podcasts. Your support helps us continue creating high-quality English learning content based on real-world topics that matter.
Yes, and we would also love to hear from you. Please tell us in the comments section where you are listening from today, whether it is Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, or anywhere else in the world. You can also share your general thoughts about today's topic, or tell us if you often follow international news in English. Reading your comments helps us understand our global audience better and create content that suits your learning needs.
Today's topic is important because events inside one country can sometimes influence international relationships, economic decisions, and diplomatic strategies. When protests happen in a country like Iran, global powers such as the United States pay attention not only because of politics, but also because of long-term interests related to regional security, international agreements, and global markets. Understanding this helps English learners see how interconnected the modern world really is.
Throughout this podcast, we will use clear and simple English to explain complex ideas. You will hear phrases like global response, economic sanctions, diplomatic relations, and international monitoring. We will repeat and explain these terms so that you can understand them easily and feel more confident when you hear them in news reports or discussions. Our goal is to help you learn English naturally while listening to meaningful and educational content.
It is also important to say that this podcast is completely educational. We will focus on facts, general explanations, and commonly used language in international discussions. We are not taking sides, and we are not encouraging any opinions or actions. Instead, we want to help you understand how global events are discussed in English and how governments usually communicate in calm and formal ways.
So, dear listeners, As you listen today, try to focus on the vocabulary, sentence structure, and pronunciation. If a sentence feels long or difficult, you can pause, listen again, and repeat it out loud. This simple practice can greatly improve your listening and speaking skills. Learning English through real-world topics like this makes the process more interesting, practical, and effective.
With that in mind, let us begin our detailed and thoughtful discussion on nationwide protests in Iran and the U.S. response, conflict, sanctions, and diplomacy. Stay with us as we explore why Iran holds global importance, why protests attract international attention, and how major powers observe and respond to such developments, all while helping you improve your English step by step. Julia, before we go deeper into specific countries or international responses, I think it is very important for our listeners to clearly understand what the term nationwide protest actually means, because this phrase is often used in news reports, but many English learners may not fully understand how it is different from smaller or local demonstrations that happen in one city or one area.
That is a very good point, Adam, because a nationwide protest is generally described as a situation where public demonstrations take place across many cities, regions, or provinces of a country at the same time or over a short period, which shows that the concerns behind the protests are not limited to one local issue, but are shared by people in different parts of the country for similar reasons.
So, if I understand correctly, Julia, a local demonstration might happen because of a city-level issue, such as transportation problems or local services. But a nationwide protest usually reflects broader concerns that affect a large part of the population, which is why it attracts more attention from national governments and international observers.
Exactly, Adam, because local demonstrations often focus on specific community problems, while nationwide protests are more closely connected to wider economic conditions, social expectations, or political dissatisfaction. And when people in many regions express similar concerns, it signals to analysts and policymakers that the issue has a broader impact on society as a whole.
One term that often appears alongside protests in news reports is civil unrest, and many English learners hear this phrase but are not always sure what it means. So could you explain how civil unrest is connected to protests and how journalists usually use this term in a neutral and factual way?
Of course, Adam. Civil unrest is a general term used to describe situations where there is public dissatisfaction that leads to protests, strikes, or demonstrations, and it does not automatically mean violence, but rather refers to social tension that becomes visible through public actions, which is why media outlets use it carefully to describe broader social conditions.
That explanation is very helpful, because it shows how language in international news is often cautious and descriptive. Another common term is public demonstration, which sounds formal. So how is this phrase usually used when discussing nationwide protests in an educational or journalistic context?
A public demonstration usually refers to an organized gathering of people who come together in public spaces to express opinions or concerns. And when demonstrations occur in many cities at the same time, they may be described as part of a nationwide protest, showing a cause and effect relationship where widespread concerns lead to widespread public expression.
I also notice that the term social movement is often used in longer analyses rather than daily news headlines. So how does a social movement differ from a single protest or demonstration, especially for listeners who are learning English through these discussions?
That is an important distinction, Adam, because a social movement usually develops over a longer period and involves ongoing efforts by groups of people to express shared goals or demands, while protests and demonstrations can be individual events within that larger movement, meaning that repeated protests can sometimes be the result of deeper social pressures.
This brings us naturally to the causes behind nationwide protests, because events like economic pressure, social demands, or political dissatisfaction are often mentioned as key reasons. So could you explain how these factors create a cause and effect situation that leads people to participate in protests across a country?
Certainly, Adam. When economic pressure increases, such as rising prices or limited job opportunities, people may feel that their daily lives are becoming more difficult, and as a result, public dissatisfaction grows, which can then lead to protests as a way for people to express concerns that they believe are not being addressed through regular channels.
So in simple cause and effect terms, economic challenges can lead to frustration. Frustration can lead to public demonstrations, and when this pattern appears in many regions, it can result in nationwide protests that gain national and international attention.
Yes, and the same cause and effect structure applies to social demands as well, because when people feel that social expectations, opportunities, or services are not meeting their needs, they may come together to express these concerns publicly, and if many communities share similar experiences, demonstrations can spread across the country.
Political dissatisfaction is another phrase that appears frequently in international discussions, but it is often used carefully. So how do analysts explain political dissatisfaction in a general and neutral way without encouraging any specific viewpoints?
Political dissatisfaction usually refers to a situation where people feel unhappy or disconnected from political decision-making processes. And when this feeling becomes widespread, it can contribute to public demonstrations, which analysts observe in order to understand social trends rather than to support or oppose any particular position.
This neutral approach is very important for educational content because our goal is to explain how and why protests happen, not to promote slogans or actions, and this helps English learners focus on language and understanding rather than emotional reactions.
Exactly, Adam. And for English learners, it is helpful to notice how news reports often use cause and effect sentences, such as economic pressure led to public demonstrations, or social demands resulted in nationwide protests, because these sentence structures are common in formal English and can improve both writing and speaking skills.
I think this section really helps listeners understand that nationwide protests are complex social events that develop over time due to multiple factors, and learning the correct vocabulary and sentence structures allows English learners to follow global news more confidently and accurately.
I agree, Adam, because once listeners understand terms like protest, civil unrest, public demonstration, and social movement, they can better understand international discussions and feel more comfortable engaging with English language news in an informed and thoughtful way.
Julia, to understand why economic topics are often mentioned when people discuss public sentiment in Iran, it is helpful to look at the broader economic environment, because Iran has faced long-term economic challenges such as inflation, employment pressure, and limited access to some global markets, and when these conditions continue for many years, they can gradually affect how people feel about daily life, future opportunities, and overall economic stability, without this automatically pointing to one single cause or one simple explanation.
That is an important starting point, Adam, because inflation, which means the general increase in prices over time, directly affects everyday expenses like food, housing, and transportation. And when prices rise faster than incomes, people may feel financial pressure, which can influence public mood and expectations, especially in economies where wages do not always increase at the same speed as the cost of living.
So if we explain this in simple cause and effect terms for English learners, higher inflation can reduce purchasing power. Reduced purchasing power can make daily life more difficult. And when this situation continues for a long period, it can shape public sentiment across different social groups, including workers, students, and small business owners, even though each group may experience these pressures in slightly different ways.
Yes, Adam. And employment pressure is another key factor to understand, because employment pressure refers to the difficulty people may face when looking for stable jobs that provide reliable income. And in countries with young populations, job availability becomes even more important, since limited employment opportunities can create uncertainty about the future and influence how people evaluate economic conditions over time.
When we compare different economic systems, we often see that access to global markets plays a significant role, because countries that can trade freely, attract investment, and participate widely in international commerce usually have more economic flexibility, while countries with limited access may face higher costs, fewer export options, and reduced competition, which can affect growth and employment levels in the long term.
In Iran's case, Adam, discussions about access to global markets are often connected to how international trade systems work, because participation in global markets can influence currency stability, investment flow, and technological exchange, and when access is restricted or limited, domestic industries may have fewer resources to grow efficiently, which can increase economic pressure inside the country over time.
For English learners, this is a good place to practice comparative language, because we can say that an economy with wider market access often experiences more trade opportunities, while an economy with limited access may rely more heavily on internal production, and this comparison helps explain why economic outcomes can differ even when countries have strong natural resources or skilled populations.
Another important point is that long-term economic stress does not usually appear suddenly, but instead develops gradually, because inflation, employment challenges, and trade limitations often build up over years, and as these pressures continue, public expectations may change, leading people to think more carefully about economic security, future planning, and social support systems without immediately linking these thoughts to specific events.
This gradual process is important to understand, because when economic stress becomes part of daily life, it can influence public conversations, media discussions, and social attitudes, and economists often study these patterns to understand how long-term conditions shape public sentiment rather than focusing only on short-term changes or isolated incidents.
From an educational perspective, Adam, this topic allows English learners to become familiar with useful economic vocabulary such as inflation, employment rate, labor market, purchasing power, and global trade, and learning these words in context makes it easier to understand international news reports that discuss economic conditions in a neutral and analytical way.
We can also explain these ideas using clear explanatory sentences, for example by saying that when employment opportunities are limited, competition for jobs increases, and when competition increases, some people may feel uncertainty about income stability, which shows a clear cause and effect structure that is very common in formal English discussions about economics.
It is also important to note that economic discussions in educational content focus on systems and trends rather than assigning blame, because understanding how economic structures function helps listeners think critically and objectively, and this neutral approach allows English learners to focus on language development while gaining a clearer understanding of how economic conditions can influence societies over time.
By looking at Iran's social and economic background in this descriptive way, listeners can better understand why economic topics often appear in discussions about public sentiment, and at the same time, they can improve their English by practicing comparative phrases, explanatory structures, and formal vocabulary that are widely used in global economic and social analysis. Julia, when people around the world hear about protests in any country, including Iran, the first question many English learners ask is how this information actually reaches them, because news does not appear automatically, but instead moves through different channels such as local reporting, international media, and global news agencies, each of which plays a specific role in shaping how events are presented and understood by audiences outside the country.
That is a very important point, Adam, because information flow is a process, not a single action, and in the case of protests, reports are usually first produced by local journalists, observers, or official statements, after which the information may be picked up by national media translated, summarized, and then shared by international news organizations that aim to explain events to a global audience in a more general and contextual way.
So, if we explain this in simple terms for English learners, information often starts locally, then moves nationally, and finally reaches the international level. And during this process, the language used in reports often becomes more formal, more neutral, and more focused on verified facts rather than emotional reactions or personal opinions.
Exactly, Adam. And international media organizations usually rely on careful reporting language because their goal is to inform audiences from different cultural and political backgrounds, which is why they often use phrases like it was reported that, according to official sources, or the situation was described as, all of which are examples of passive voice that help maintain a neutral and professional tone.
Passive voice is something English learners hear very often in news reports, but they may not always recognize it. So this is a good opportunity to explain that passive voice is used when the focus is on the event itself, rather than on who performed the action, such as saying protests were reported in several cities instead of naming a specific person or group.
That is correct. And this type of language is especially common when information is still developing or when journalists want to avoid making strong claims. Because saying it was observed or it was announced allows reporters to share information while clearly showing that the report is based on observation or official communication, rather than personal judgment.
Another major part of modern information flow is the role of social platforms, which allow information to spread very quickly, sometimes faster than traditional news outlets. And this speed can increase global awareness. But it also means that international media organizations often take extra time to verify details before publishing their reports.
Yes, Adam, social platforms can influence how quickly information becomes visible internationally, but established news agencies usually follow verification processes, which means they compare multiple sources, check official statements, and confirm details before releasing reports. And this careful approach helps maintain credibility and trust among global audiences.
From a government perspective, responses to media coverage can differ depending on the situation, because some governments may issue official statements to clarify their position, while others may choose to monitor developments quietly. And these responses are often described in neutral terms, such as a statement was released or officials indicated concern.
This is where reporting language becomes very important, because journalists often describe government reactions using indirect expressions. For example, by saying the situation was described as being closely monitored, which again uses passive voice to focus on the action rather than on individual decision-makers.
For English learners, this section is very useful because media-related vocabulary appears frequently in international news, and words like coverage, broadcast, reporting, source, and statement are essential for understanding how information is shared and interpreted across borders.
It is also helpful to notice how cause and effect relationships are sometimes implied in reporting, such as when increased media coverage leads to greater international attention, or when official statements are issued in response to widespread reporting. And these structures help listeners understand how information flow influences global discussions.
What is especially interesting is that international audiences often receive a summarized version of events because global media focuses on context and relevance rather than local detail. And this approach helps viewers and listeners understand why an event matters globally without needing to know every local aspect.
From an educational point of view, Adam, learning how media language works allows English learners to become more confident listeners, because once they recognize patterns like passive voice, reported speech, and neutral phrasing, they can follow complex news stories more easily and with less confusion.
It also reminds us that media reports are designed to inform rather than instruct, which is why responsible educational discussions focus on explanation and context, not on methods or actions. And this helps keep conversations factual, balanced, and suitable for a global audience.
In the end, Understanding the role of media and information flow helps listeners see how global awareness is created, how language is carefully chosen in news reports, and how passive voice and formal vocabulary are used to describe sensitive events in a calm and professional way.
By paying attention to this language and these structures, English learners can improve their comprehension skills and feel more comfortable engaging with international news, while also developing a clearer understanding of how information about major events travels across countries and reaches audiences around the world. Julia, when international events take place in a country like Iran, many listeners notice that the United States often reacts in a very structured and formal way, and for English learners it is useful to understand that these responses are usually guided by long-established foreign policy principles rather than by immediate emotions, because governments tend to follow procedures that emphasize caution, consistency, and alignment with broader international goals.
That is correct, Adam, because US foreign policy responses are typically shaped by institutions, laws, and diplomatic traditions, and when events inside another country attract international attention, the first step is often the release of public statements, which are carefully written messages that explain the official position in neutral and precise language without creating unnecessary tension or misunderstanding.
Public statements are interesting from a language perspective, because they often include formal expressions such as the situation is being closely monitored or concerns have been expressed, which show how passive voice and indirect language are used to communicate attention and interest while avoiding direct accusations or emotional wording.
Exactly. And these statements are usually delivered by official spokespersons or government departments, and they are designed not only for domestic audiences, but also for international partners, which is why the language remains diplomatic, measured, and respectful, even when the situation itself is complex or sensitive.
Another common element of U.S. responses is diplomatic pressure, which is a term that may sound strong, but in practice it often refers to actions such as discussions with allies, consultations within international organizations, or formal communication through diplomatic channels, all of which are intended to influence outcomes without direct confrontation.
From an educational point of view, Adam, it is helpful to explain that diplomatic pressure usually involves dialogue, negotiation, and coordination rather than force, and phrases like engaging with partners, calling for restraint, or urging dialogue are frequently used in official language to express these efforts in a calm and formal manner.
Policy reviews are another important part of how governments respond to international developments, because when situations evolve, policymakers often reassess existing policies to determine whether adjustments are necessary, and this process is usually described using careful language, such as a review is underway, or options are being evaluated.
This kind of wording is very common in international relations because it signals attention and responsibility without making immediate commitments. And for English learners, it provides a good example of how formal English uses passive constructions to focus on processes rather than on individual decision-makers.
It is also important to note that responses are rarely made in isolation, because the United States often coordinates with allies and international institutions, and this cooperation is reflected in phrases like in consultation with partners or within a multilateral framework, which show how diplomacy is often a shared effort.
Yes, Adam, and this cooperative approach helps maintain consistency in international relations, because when multiple countries express similar positions through aligned statements or joint actions, it reinforces the idea that global responses are guided by shared principles rather than by unilateral decisions.
For English learners, this section is especially useful because diplomatic language tends to be formal and structured, and learning expressions such as official response, policy framework, diplomatic engagement, and international norms can significantly improve comprehension of news related to foreign affairs.
It also helps listeners understand why government responses may seem slow or cautious, because diplomacy values careful consideration, legal review, and long-term impact, And this approach explains why immediate reactions are often replaced by measured statements and gradual policy discussions.
By understanding these general principles, listeners can better interpret international news without assuming intent or emotion, and instead recognize that official responses are part of established systems designed to manage complex global relationships.
In this way, learning about US responses to events in Iran becomes not just a lesson in international politics, but also a practical exercise in understanding formal English, diplomatic vocabulary, and the calm, structured tone that is commonly used in global discussions.
Julia, when people hear about international news regarding Iran, one of the terms that appears frequently is sanctions, and for English learners, it is important to understand exactly what this word means, because sanctions are not simple punishments, but rather formal economic and diplomatic tools that countries or groups of countries use to influence behavior, policies, or decisions of another government, and they are usually designed to create pressure without direct military involvement, which makes them a central concept in global economic and political discussions.
Exactly, Adam. Economic sanctions can be defined as restrictions that one country or a group of countries imposes on another in order to influence its actions. And these restrictions can take many forms, including limiting trade, freezing financial assets, restricting investment, or controlling access to technology and goods. And while the intention behind sanctions is usually to achieve specific political or security goals, their effects are often felt broadly across the economy, affecting both governments and ordinary citizens in ways that can be direct or indirect, depending on how strictly the sanctions are applied.
That makes sense, Julia, because when sanctions are applied, they do not only influence political decisions, but they also impact everyday life for people inside the targeted country. And this is why understanding cause and effect relationships is crucial for English learners, as we can see how restrictions on exports or imports can lead to higher prices, shortages of certain products, and challenges for local industries, which in turn may affect employment, income, and general economic confidence over time.
Yes, Adam. And the goals of sanctions are generally intended to encourage compliance with international norms or agreements, to signal disapproval of certain policies, or to persuade governments to change specific behaviors. And this means that sanctions are usually accompanied by clear public statements explaining their purpose, such as to promote diplomatic negotiations, to uphold international law, or to reduce activities that threaten regional stability, which helps both domestic and international audiences understand why sanctions are being applied.
From an educational perspective, Julia, this is an excellent example of how conditional and explanatory sentences are used in English, because you can say something like, if trade restrictions are increased, then local industries may face difficulties producing goods, or if foreign investment is limited, then economic growth may slow, and these sentences show how cause and effect is communicated clearly, which is essential when discussing complex international issues like sanctions.
Absolutely, Adam. Another aspect to consider is that sanctions can vary in severity and scope, ranging from targeted sanctions against specific individuals or companies, which may include travel bans or asset freezes, to comprehensive measures that affect entire sectors such as banking, energy, or manufacturing. And this variation demonstrates that the design of sanctions is often strategic, aiming to influence specific behaviors while trying to minimize unintended consequences, although some impact on the broader population is almost inevitable.
For English learners, this section is particularly helpful because it introduces several important terms that appear frequently in global news and discussions, including economic pressure, asset freeze, trade restrictions, compliance, and international norms, and understanding these words in context allows listeners to follow reports about sanctions more confidently and to analyze both their intended and unintended effects using precise English vocabulary.
It is also important to note that sanctions create a series of connected outcomes, because when restrictions are applied, governments may have fewer resources to fund public services. Companies may struggle to maintain production or employment levels, and citizens may experience higher living costs or reduced access to imported goods, which illustrates a chain of cause and effect that is often described in formal reporting using phrases such as resulted in, led to, or contributed to, helping learners recognize patterns in professional English.
Moreover, sanctions are sometimes combined with diplomatic negotiations or international monitoring to encourage compliance, and this means that while the immediate economic effects are important, policymakers also consider how sanctions can influence behavior over time, how signals are received by other governments, and how public perception may change as a result of visible pressure on the target country, which demonstrates the complexity of international decision-making and the careful language used in reporting such actions.
For listeners, learning about sanctions in this structured and neutral way provides both English language practice and practical understanding of global affairs, because it highlights how formal vocabulary, conditional statements, and clear explanations allow analysts, journalists, and governments to communicate complex situations without exaggeration or emotional bias. And by observing these structures, learners can improve both comprehension and the ability to use precise language in their own discussions.
In summary, sanctions are a fundamental part of international relations that serve as tools for influencing behavior, promoting compliance with agreements, and expressing disapproval in a structured way. And by studying their purpose, types, and broad effects, English learners can expand their understanding of global politics while practicing vocabulary, sentence structures, and cause and effect reasoning that are essential for discussing sensitive and complex issues clearly and professionally.
Yes, Adam. And as we continue with our discussion in the following sections, listeners will see how sanctions connect to diplomatic pressure, international responses, and regional developments, providing a full picture of why they are applied, how they function in practice, and how language is carefully chosen to describe their intended goals and broader impacts without creating confusion or bias, which is exactly the type of real-world English learning we aim to provide in the English Globe.
Julia, when we look at international relations, especially situations like those in Iran, one thing that often comes up in news reports is diplomacy. And for English learners, it is important to understand that diplomacy is essentially the process by which countries communicate, negotiate, and manage differences without resorting to force, because it provides a structured and peaceful way to address disagreements, maintain stability, and uphold international norms, and these processes are often described using formal language and careful phrasing in both media reports and government statements.
That is absolutely correct, Adam. Diplomacy is a central tool in international relations because it allows countries to explore solutions through dialogue rather than conflict, and this process can include a variety of mechanisms, such as the work of embassies, formal negotiations, participation in international agreements, and even indirect talks mediated by third parties or international organizations, all of which are designed to ensure that communication continues even when tensions exist, and that any decisions are made in a controlled, measured, and legally recognized manner.
Embassies, for instance, play a particularly important role in diplomacy because they serve as official channels of communication between countries, allowing governments to exchange information, express positions, and manage ongoing relationships. And reports often use phrases like, "It was communicated through the embassy" or "officials at the embassy indicated," which shows the formal and neutral language that is characteristic of diplomatic communication and the careful use of passive constructions that shift the focus onto the action rather than on individuals.
Yes, Adam, and embassies also facilitate practical cooperation, such as organizing meetings, conveying messages, and negotiating agreements, which can involve anything from trade discussions to human rights dialogues. And for English learners, recognizing vocabulary such as diplomatic mission, official channels, liaison, and consular communication is very helpful for understanding news articles, formal briefings, and discussions about international relations in both spoken and written English.
Negotiations themselves are another critical aspect, Julia, because they are structured discussions where each side presents its positions, listens to the other, and explores possible compromises. And this is where formal and polite language is especially important, because phrases like "it was suggested that," "officials proposed," or "the parties agreed to consider" are commonly used to describe exchanges without implying hostility or disrespect, which helps maintain stability and a sense of mutual understanding even during tense situations.
Exactly, Adam. And in international reporting, it is common to see indirect language used in negotiations, because journalists and officials often describe positions without attributing personal opinion, such as the proposal was met with careful consideration or the suggestion was noted by officials, which shows both the use of passive voice and the focus on actions rather than individuals. And this is a useful model for English learners who want to practice formal and neutral phrasing.
International agreements are also a key element of diplomacy, because they provide formal written frameworks for cooperation or for resolving disputes. And these agreements can cover a wide range of topics, including trade, energy, security, or human rights. And phrases such as "the agreement was signed," "terms were outlined," and "conditions were agreed upon" are often used in formal English to describe these processes, providing learners with examples of professional and precise language that is widely used in media and academic texts.
Another important point, Adam, is that diplomacy often includes indirect talks or third-party mediation, which can involve countries or organizations acting as facilitators between two parties that may not communicate directly due to political sensitivities or security concerns, and in these situations, language is even more carefully chosen. With expressions like "mediation was offered," talks were conducted under the auspices of, and discussions were facilitated by, demonstrating both formal vocabulary and neutral reporting structures that are ideal for educational content.
For English learners, this section is particularly valuable because it provides exposure to polite disagreement and negotiation language, which is commonly used in professional and international contexts, such as while acknowledging differences, officials emphasized the importance of dialogue, or the parties maintained differing perspectives, but continued discussions in a constructive manner, showing how formal English can express disagreement without conflict or disrespect.
Yes, Adam. And it is also useful to notice comparative and conditional phrasing in diplomatic language, such as if both sides agree to follow the terms, stability can be maintained or, although challenges remain, continued dialogue may lead to constructive outcomes, which helps listeners see how cause and effect and hypothetical reasoning are integrated into professional English communication while remaining neutral and descriptive.
Another aspect of diplomacy is its emphasis on long-term stability, because the goal is not just to respond to immediate events, but to create frameworks that prevent misunderstandings, reduce tension, and build trust over time. And this long-term perspective is reflected in language, such as measures were taken to ensure ongoing cooperation, mechanisms were established for regular consultation, and monitoring processes were implemented, all of which use formal and neutral constructions that are ideal for English learners to practice and replicate.
In addition, diplomacy frequently involves repetition and careful clarification, because international relations require precision, and miscommunication can have serious consequences. So phrases such as "the statement was clarified," "the position was reiterated," and officials emphasized consistency in approach are often included in reports, giving learners repeated exposure to professional vocabulary and structures that reinforce both comprehension and usage skills.
From an educational perspective, this section provides an excellent opportunity for learners to practice vocabulary related to negotiation, cooperation, and formal communication, including words and phrases like diplomatic engagement, facilitation, mediated talks, official channel, agreement framework, and constructive dialogue, all of which are commonly encountered in formal news coverage and international analysis.
Furthermore, understanding diplomatic channels and negotiation strategies helps learners recognize patterns of formal English, including careful attribution, passive voice, polite disagreement, and conditional reasoning, which are widely used in international reporting, official statements, and academic writing. And observing these patterns allows listeners to improve both comprehension and expression when discussing global events in English.
In conclusion, diplomacy provides structured, peaceful, and professional methods for managing international issues, allowing countries to communicate, negotiate, and cooperate without conflict. And by studying embassies, negotiations, international agreements, and indirect talks, English learners gain not only vocabulary and sentence structures, but also a clearer understanding of how global communication functions, emphasizing dialogue, stability, and adherence to international norms, which is essential for anyone aiming to follow world events in a professional and informed manner.
Exactly, Adam. By paying attention to formal vocabulary, reporting language, polite disagreement, and conditional expressions, listeners can both understand how diplomacy works and improve their English skills significantly, learning to discuss complex international situations calmly, clearly, and professionally, which is precisely the kind of real-world English education that we aim to provide here at the English Globe.
Julia, as we continue our discussion, it is important to consider how events in one country, such as protests or economic disruptions in Iran, can extend beyond its borders and influence neighboring regions and global systems, because countries today are interconnected in many ways, including trade, energy supply, finance, and diplomacy. And understanding these connections is essential for English learners, as it helps them follow complex news stories, recognize cause and effect relationships, and learn vocabulary that describes global interactions in a neutral, educational way.
Absolutely, Adam. When we talk about regional and global implications, we are referring to the ways in which economic, social, or political developments in one country can have ripple effects on others. For example, through cross-border trade, energy markets, supply chains, or regional alliances. And this type of discussion requires careful language, because while connections exist, it is important not to exaggerate outcomes or make predictions, but rather to describe the systems and dependencies in a factual and explanatory manner that is suitable for English learners.
One clear example of these connections is energy markets, because Iran is a significant producer of oil and gas, and even small disruptions in production or transport can influence energy availability and pricing in nearby countries and, in some cases, global markets, and phrases such as energy supplies were affected. Prices were influenced by regional developments, and market stability depends on consistent production are commonly used in professional reporting, offering learners examples of formal and descriptive English that link multiple ideas within single sentences.
Exactly, Adam. And trade is another area where interconnections are evident, because countries depend on one another for imports and exports of goods, raw materials, and industrial products. So when disruptions occur in one country, even in a non-predictive way, it can influence production schedules, supply chains, and regional commerce, which can be described with formal linking expressions, like as a result of changes in trade flows, due to interconnected markets, or because of reliance on imported goods, helping English learners understand and practice complex sentence structures.
Additionally, regional stability is closely observed by governments and international organizations, because instability in one country can affect neighboring countries' political and economic environments, including border management, migration patterns, and diplomatic relations. And this type of explanation often uses compound and complex sentences to link multiple ideas, such as while local conditions are evolving, neighboring countries may adjust their policies in response to shared concerns, which demonstrates how interdependent regional systems operate.
Yes, Adam, and global financial systems can also be affected indirectly because capital markets, currency valuations, and investment flows are sensitive to geopolitical developments, meaning that even events confined to one country can have effects elsewhere, which is why professional reporting often includes careful phrasing, such as investors are monitoring regional developments. Financial stability may be influenced by cross-border factors, and international portfolios are adjusted in response to evolving conditions, all of which provide useful language examples for English learners.
Another important point is that media and official reports often emphasize connections without creating alarm. Using neutral, explanatory language, such as interconnected systems, can transmit effects. Regional dependencies exist in trade and energy, or supply chains rely on stable conditions across multiple countries, which demonstrates how professional communication links multiple ideas in single sentences while remaining factual, calm, and suitable for educational purposes.
English learners can also benefit from understanding how phrases like ripple effects, systemic impact, cross-border dependencies, and interconnected markets are used in context, because these terms appear frequently in both news and academic reporting, and they allow learners to describe complex relationships between events, countries, and economic or political systems using precise, neutral language that is appropriate for professional discussion.
Furthermore, describing regional and global implications often requires combining multiple clauses to explain sequence, cause, and effect, such as, because one country supplies key resources to its neighbors, any change in domestic production can influence regional trade patterns, which in turn may affect pricing and availability in distant markets. And practicing these structures helps learners improve their comprehension of long, complex sentences that are common in formal English reporting.
Finally, Adam, understanding regional and global implications is not only about following events, but also about recognizing the vocabulary and sentence structures that convey complexity, neutrality, and factual connections, so that English learners can describe interdependent systems accurately, link multiple ideas in a single statement, and discuss the consequences of developments without exaggeration, speculation, or alarmist language, which is exactly the approach we aim for here at the English Globe.
Yes, Julia, and by focusing on these connections, listeners can appreciate how countries are economically, politically, and socially linked, while simultaneously practicing formal vocabulary, complex sentence structures, and explanatory language that is crucial for understanding professional reporting, global affairs, and the nuanced ways in which events in one region can have far-reaching but carefully described consequences for other parts of the world.
So, dear listeners, when you read or listen to international news, remember that phrases like interconnected systems, regional impact, and global implications are not meant to create fear, but to explain real-world linkages in a clear, structured, and neutral way, allowing you to both understand international developments and improve your English comprehension and communication skills through professional, descriptive language.
Julia, as we continue exploring global responses to nationwide protests, one area that often appears in formal discussions is the role of international law and human rights frameworks, because these frameworks provide a set of established standards that guide how events are observed, reported, and addressed by international organizations. And understanding this context is particularly valuable for English learners, as it introduces formal academic vocabulary and shows how complex ideas can be communicated in a neutral and structured way without assigning blame or making predictions.
Exactly, Adam. International law refers to the body of rules and agreements that govern the relationships between states, and when events like nationwide protests occur, international organizations often observe and document these events using legal criteria, including treaties, conventions, and customary law, in order to assess whether rights, obligations, and standards are being respected. This observation process is usually described using formal reporting language, such as incidents were documented, authorities were called upon to provide information, or compliance with international standards was assessed, all of which provide English learners with clear examples of passive constructions and formal phrasing.
It is also interesting, Julia, that human rights frameworks play a complementary role, because organizations such as the United Nations, international monitoring groups, and regional bodies often rely on human rights principles to evaluate how governments respect fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression, assembly, and access to information. And these principles are reflected in formal vocabulary that frequently appears in reports, like rights were protected, freedoms were upheld, and obligations were observed, demonstrating both neutral tone and professional English usage.
Yes, Adam. And an essential part of this discussion is the balance between state sovereignty and international norms. Because while countries have the right to govern their internal affairs, international law establishes certain expectations for the treatment of citizens and for maintaining peace, security, and human dignity. Journalists and diplomats often use language like "while respecting national sovereignty" in accordance with international obligations or consistent with legal frameworks to explain this balance, providing English learners with structured, formal expressions that connect multiple ideas within one sentence.
From an educational perspective, Julia, this is an excellent opportunity to practice formal academic vocabulary, such as jurisdiction, compliance, monitoring, standards, obligations, principles, and frameworks, because these words are commonly used in professional reporting, legal analysis, and international discussions, and understanding their meaning in context helps listeners follow news and reports about global events more confidently while improving their comprehension of complex sentences.
Another important element is the careful use of neutral explanatory language, because international organizations aim to report facts and assess situations without assigning motives or expressing opinions. Phrases such as "the situation was evaluated according to established guidelines," "data was collected and analyzed," and "observations were reported to relevant bodies" are often used, demonstrating how English can be formal, precise, and objective, which is an essential skill for learners who want to discuss global issues professionally.
It is also useful to notice that cause and effect and conditional structures are frequently employed when discussing international law and human rights, such as if violations are identified, recommendations may be made to authorities, or when reports are submitted, they are reviewed by independent experts, which shows how complex processes are communicated clearly in English, while remaining factual and respectful of all parties involved.
Yes, Adam. Observing events through legal and human rights frameworks also emphasizes transparency and accountability, because organizations document incidents, verify sources, and provide structured reports to ensure that information is reliable, verifiable, and neutral. Phrases like "procedures were followed," "evidence was examined," and "findings were documented" appear frequently in professional contexts, giving learners practical examples of formal language and reporting structures.
Another important concept is that international law and human rights frameworks provide guidance for both governments and the public, without imposing direct enforcement in every case, meaning that these frameworks function more as standards and expectations rather than immediate mandates. And this distinction is expressed in professional English through terms like "in accordance with," "consistent with," "guided by," and "under international norms," which are useful for learners practicing formal explanatory sentences.
It is also essential to recognize that these frameworks operate with respect for multiple perspectives, because while international organizations may provide analysis, governments are expected to implement recommendations in a way that aligns with national contexts and formal expressions, such as recommendations were considered by national authorities, measures were adjusted to align with domestic law, and coordination was established between international and national bodies, help convey these ideas clearly while maintaining a neutral and factual tone.
For English learners, this discussion demonstrates how to link multiple ideas using compound and complex sentences, combining cause and effect reasoning, conditional statements, and neutral reporting language, such as when international standards are followed. Governments can strengthen credibility, while violations may be addressed through consultations and monitoring, which mirrors the way professionals describe events in academic, journalistic, or diplomatic contexts.
Finally, Adam, learning about international law and human rights frameworks allows listeners not only to improve their vocabulary and sentence construction, but also to understand how global monitoring works, how formal reporting is structured, and how governments navigate the balance between sovereignty and international norms, all while remaining respectful, neutral, and fact-based, which is essential for anyone following international news or learning professional English.
Exactly, Julia. By understanding these frameworks, listeners can follow complex international events with confidence, recognize formal academic expressions, and practice professional English that is precise, respectful, and explanatory, which is precisely the kind of educational and practical English learning experience that we aim to provide here at the English Globe, helping learners improve both their comprehension of global affairs and their ability to communicate about them accurately and professionally. Julia, as we reach the final section of today's podcast, I think it is important to focus on how English learners can benefit from following international news and global events, such as the nationwide protests in Iran and the various diplomatic, economic, and legal responses we have discussed. While these topics are complex, our main goal here is not to make political judgments, but to use them as opportunities for language growth, which includes expanding vocabulary, improving listening comprehension, practicing sentence structures, and enhancing critical thinking skills. Because when learners engage with real-world content, they are exposed to formal, neutral, and descriptive English that is used in professional, academic, and journalistic contexts.
Exactly, Adam. Listening to or reading news about global events allows English learners to encounter a wide variety of vocabulary that is essential for professional and academic English. For instance, during today's discussion, we introduced terms such as diplomatic engagement, international norms, sanctions, regional dependencies, human rights frameworks, compliance, and interconnected systems, all of which frequently appear in formal news reports, research articles, and educational materials. By focusing on these words in context rather than memorizing lists, learners can understand how they are used in complete sentences, which helps with comprehension, retention, and the ability to produce accurate, natural English when discussing similar topics.
Yes, Julia. Another benefit of following international news is that learners are exposed to complex sentence structures, including cause and effect relationships, conditional sentences, compound and complex clauses, and formal reporting language. For example, in our discussion of sanctions, we used sentences like, if trade restrictions are increased, then local industries may face difficulties producing goods, which shows both conditional reasoning and formal vocabulary. And in the context of diplomacy, we described processes using sentences such as, while tensions exist, countries may continue dialogue through embassies and mediated talks to maintain stability and adherence to international norms. Practicing comprehension of such structures helps learners improve both reading and listening skills in a practical and meaningful context.
That's right, Adam. Exposure to real-world English also helps learners develop critical thinking and reflection skills. When students read or listen to global events, they can reflect on cause and effect relationships, the reasoning behind government actions, and the broader implications of political, economic, and social developments. For instance, in our discussion today, we explored how nationwide protests can arise from social and economic pressures, how sanctions function as tools of diplomacy, and how regional and global systems are interconnected, and reflecting on these ideas encourages learners to think analytically, summarize information, and practice expressing their thoughts in structured English sentences, all of which are invaluable skills for both language development and general knowledge.
Julia, another key point is that learners should focus on understanding language and communication techniques rather than forming immediate opinions about politics or international conflicts. By analyzing how journalists, diplomats, and experts explain events in neutral and formal language, learners can identify strategies such as the use of passive voice, cautious phrasing, conditional statements, polite disagreement, and explanatory linking phrases, which are fundamental for professional English communication. For instance, phrases like "the situation was monitored carefully," "recommendations were made in accordance with international law," and "officials emphasized ongoing dialogue," all demonstrate how neutrality and clarity are maintained while conveying complex information, and recognizing these patterns allows learners to use similar structures in their own speaking and writing.
Exactly, Adam. In addition, following global news helps learners notice repetition, clarification, and structured explanations, which are essential features of professional English. In today's discussion, we repeatedly explained terms such as human rights frameworks, interconnected systems, and diplomatic engagement, while also demonstrating their application in multiple contexts. This repetition, combined with the neutral explanatory style, allows learners to internalize new vocabulary and sentence structures naturally, which improves listening comprehension, reading comprehension, and overall English fluency. By observing these techniques, students can gradually replicate them in writing reports, delivering presentations, or participating in academic discussions.
Julia, I would also like to highlight the importance of reflective learning, which involves actively thinking about the language we hear while listening to global events. For example, when learners listen to formal news about sanctions or diplomatic negotiations, they can pause and ask themselves questions such as, what is the main idea of this sentence? What vocabulary is new to me? How is the cause and effect relationship expressed? How can I paraphrase this sentence in my own words? This reflection not only improves comprehension, but also encourages active engagement with language, which is much more effective than passive listening or rote memorization.
Yes, Adam. Reflective learning also helps learners recognize and practice formal discourse markers, connectors, and transitional phrases, which are commonly used in reporting and academic English. Words and phrases such as however, therefore, in accordance with, as a result, while considering, and despite these conditions help link ideas logically, showing relationships between causes, effects, and explanations. Practicing these connectors in context enhances the ability to produce coherent and professional English, which is especially important for learners who want to communicate clearly about complex topics, whether in writing, presentations, or discussions.
Julia, another reason to study global events as an English student is that it encourages the use of analytical and descriptive language, which is more formal and precise than casual English. For example, instead of simply saying things are bad in a country, one can use expressions like economic pressures and social demands have contributed to nationwide protests, or regional dependencies and trade restrictions may influence market stability, which are accurate, neutral, and suitable for academic or professional contexts. Using such language allows learners to discuss complex topics confidently while practicing sentence structures that are longer, more detailed, and reflective of formal English.
Furthermore, following international news helps learners recognize how tone, neutrality, and respectful phrasing are used in professional communication. In our discussion today, we have focused on avoiding emotive language, exaggeration, or alarmist statements, instead describing events factually, using formal vocabulary and structured sentences. This approach teaches learners how to communicate sensitive topics responsibly in English, which is especially valuable for students who want to improve comprehension of news, academic texts, or diplomatic discourse without becoming confused by biased or emotionally charged language.
Exactly, Julia. Another benefit is that learners develop the ability to summarize, paraphrase, and explain complex information in simple terms, which is a key skill for English fluency. For example, after listening to reports about sanctions, diplomacy, or regional implications, students can practice saying, "Sanctions are economic restrictions used to influence government actions without force," or "Diplomatic channels allow countries to communicate and negotiate peacefully," or "Events in one country can have ripple effects on neighboring regions and global markets." These exercises reinforce comprehension, vocabulary retention, and sentence-building skills in context.
Adam, it is also important to remember that regular exposure to international news allows learners to hear how English is used in professional, academic, and journalistic contexts, where precision, neutrality, and formal structures are essential. By repeatedly listening to formal explanations, neutral reporting, and structured descriptions, learners internalize patterns of English that are difficult to acquire through textbooks alone, including linking clauses, expressing conditional reasoning, describing cause and effect, and maintaining a professional tone while communicating complex ideas.
In addition, listening to global events encourages learners to think critically and reflectively, asking questions such as, "Why did this happen? What are the potential implications? How is this described in neutral English?" This type of analytical thinking develops comprehension and communication skills while also building confidence in discussing sophisticated topics in English. Learners begin to see connections between language and content, understanding not only what is happening, but also how to describe it accurately and professionally.
Finally, Adam, it is important to encourage listeners to be patient and persistent, because learning English through real-world events takes time. Vocabulary, sentence structures, and formal phrasing will become easier to understand and use with consistent practice. Students should focus on understanding language patterns, reflecting on meanings, and practicing listening, speaking, and writing in context, rather than immediately forming political judgments or opinions about the events themselves. This approach ensures that English learning is both educational and enjoyable, while providing a framework for professional communication in any context.
In conclusion, Julia, following global events like the protests in Iran and international responses offers English learners a unique and valuable opportunity to improve vocabulary, practice complex sentence structures, enhance listening comprehension, and develop critical thinking skills. By focusing on language, reflection, and understanding professional and neutral reporting, students can grow as confident, informed English speakers, able to discuss global issues accurately and clearly, while simultaneously learning the formal structures, vocabulary, and strategies used by journalists, academics, and diplomats.
Exactly, Adam. And to all our listeners, remember that every news story, every report, and every formal explanation is an opportunity to expand your English skills, improve comprehension, and practice professional communication. Focus on learning language patterns, reflecting on ideas, and connecting vocabulary and sentence structures to real-world events, because this combination of learning and reflection is the most effective way to build confidence, fluency, and a deeper understanding of both English and the world.
So, dear listeners, as we conclude this long and detailed discussion, take a moment to reflect on the vocabulary we used, the formal sentence structures we practiced, and the analytical thinking we applied to today's topic. Remember that your goal as English learners is to grow in language proficiency and comprehension, not to make judgments about political matters, and by following these methods, you will continue to improve your English while gaining insights into global affairs, which is exactly what we aim to provide here at the English Globe, helping you become a more skilled, confident, an informed English communicator.
Yes, Adam. Keep practicing, stay curious, and remember that every time you listen to a podcast, read a news article, or analyze a report, you are strengthening your English skills, learning formal vocabulary, and developing the ability to describe complex events accurately and professionally. This consistent effort, combined with reflection and attention to language, will help you grow as both a learner and a communicator in English.
Thank you for listening, dear students, and we hope you found today's podcast both educational and inspiring. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your reflections in the comments section, because your engagement helps create a community of learners who are improving their English while exploring global events thoughtfully and professionally.
And remember, every discussion about international events is also a lesson in English. By focusing on vocabulary, sentence structures, and reflective learning, you will continue to improve your skills while understanding the world around you in a structured, respectful, and professional way. Stay curious, practice regularly, and enjoy the journey of learning English through global events.